Man visits shelter, and pit bull starts crying. James walked into the animal shelter, the cold air outside replaced by the warm but slightly musky scent of animals. The sound of barking and soft whimpers filled the space. It was a cacophony of emotions: joy, sadness, hope, and despair, all encapsulated in the small, caged hearts of the animals that lived there. James felt a lump rise in his throat as he scanned the rows of kennels. For the past 6 months, James had been living with an ache in his chest that refused to fade. Max, his golden retriever and his best friend of 12 years, had passed away from old age. The loss had left James shattered. Every corner of his home reminded him of Max: the leash hanging by the fireplace, the leash hanging by the door, and the lingering echo of his paws tapping against the wooden floors. He had tried to cope by throwing himself into work and spending weekends on long, solitary hikes, but the emptiness in his heart only grew heavier. Today, he wasn't entirely sure what had brought him to the shelter. Maybe it was the loneliness that had become too suffocating, or maybe it was the distant hope that another furry friend could help heal his broken heart. Whatever the reason, James found himself standing in the middle of the shelter, overwhelmed and unsure. "Hi there, can I help you with anything?" a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. James turned to see a young woman wearing a green shelter uniform. Her name tag read Megan. She had a kind smile and an air of patience, the kind you'd expect from someone who had spent years caring for animals in need. Yeah, James said, his voice hesitant. "I was just looking. I lost my dog a while back, and I thought maybe I disappeared." He stopped abruptly. "Oh," he said again, his voice still hesitant. Megan's smile softened. "I'm sorry to hear about your loss. Losing a pet is never easy, but it's wonderful that you're here. Let me show you around, and you can meet some of our residents. Who knows, maybe one of them will choose you." James followed Megan down the narrow aisle of kennels. The animals inside ranged from playful puppies bouncing with energy to older dogs lying quietly in their beds. Some wagged their tails eagerly as James passed, while others stayed curled up, their eyes wary and guarded. As they walked, Megan shared some of the stories behind the animals. There was a husky named Luna, surrendered by her owners after they had a baby and could no longer care for her. A scrappy terrier mix named Milo had been found wandering the streets, his fur matted and his ribs showing. Each story tugged at James's heart, but he didn't feel that click, that unexplainable connection he was searching for. And then he saw him. In the farthest corner of the shelter, away from the more active and attention-seeking dogs, sat a pit bull. His cage was larger, but he seemed to shrink into the back of it, as if trying to make himself invisible. His coat was a dull shade of brown, with a white patch on his chest. He wasn't barking or pacing like the others. Instead, he sat quietly, his head lowered and his eyes fixed on the ground. "What about him?" James asked, stopping in front of the cage. Megan's expression shifted slightly. There was a hint of sadness in her eyes as she looked at the dog. "That's Buddy. He's been with us for a long time, almost 3 years now. He was rescued from a really bad situation. His previous owner, well, let's just say Buddy didn't have a good life before he came here. He's a sweet dog, but he's had trouble trusting people. Most visitors pass him by because he doesn't really..." James crouched down to get a closer look at Buddy. The dog didn't move, but his eyes flicked up for a brief moment, meeting James's gaze. That single glance hit James like a punch to the chest. In those deep, soulful eyes, he saw pain, fear, and a quiet longing, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the wind. "Hey, buddy," James said softly. He reached out through the bars of the cage, his hand open and palm up, a gesture of peace. For a moment, nothing happened. Buddy stayed still, his body tense. But then, as if something inside him had shifted, he slowly stood up and took a hesitant step forward. His movements were cautious, almost as if he expected to be punished for approaching. When Buddy was close enough, James saw something he hadn't noticed before. Tears. Actual tears were streaming down the dog's face, glistening in the fluorescent light of the shelter. James's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "He's crying," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Megan nodded, her own eyes misty. "He does that sometimes. It's not common for dogs to cry like that, but Buddy, he's different. We think it's his way of expressing his emotions. He's been through so much, and I think he just feels everything very deeply." James reached further into the cage, his fingers brushing against Buddy's fur. The dog flinched at first, but then he leaned in, pressing his head against James's hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, James knew he didn't just feel pity for Buddy, he felt a connection, a pull so strong that it erased any lingering doubts he had about coming to the shelter. "Oh, take him," James said, his voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill over. Megan looked surprised. "Are you sure? Buddy's a wonderful dog, but he'll need a lot of patience and understanding. It won't be easy." James nodded. "I'm sure. He's been through enough. He deserves a second chance, and I think maybe I do too." As James signed the adoption papers, Buddy watched him with a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. When the cage door finally opened, Buddy stepped out slowly, his tail wagging ever so slightly. James knelt down to meet him. "We're going to be okay, Buddy," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time in months, James felt something shift inside him. A tiny spark of hope, fueled by the quiet strength of a dog who had survived so much. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment, they had each other. And that was enough. Meeting the pit bull. As James passed the rows of kennels, his eyes were drawn to a pit bull sitting silently in the corner of its cage. Unlike the other dogs, who barked and wagged their tails for attention, this dog seemed withdrawn. His head hung low as if carrying the weight of the world. "That's Buddy," Megan, the shelter staff member, said. "He's been here for 3 years. He was rescued from a really bad situation, and it's taken him a long time to trust anyone. Most visitors don't notice him, but he's one of the sweetest dogs here." James crouched down, his hand extended toward the bars. "Hey there, Buddy," he said softly. Buddy hesitated, his body trembling as he took a small step forward. Then, as James's hand brushed against his fur, Buddy's eyes welled up with tears. James felt his heart break. "It cries," said Hiame, his voice filled with emotion. Megan nodded. "It's rare, but Buddy does that sometimes. It's like he's trying to tell us how he feels." In that moment, James knew he couldn't leave the shelter without Buddy. Despite his fear and pain, the dog had chosen to trust James, and James was determined to earn that trust. The bond begins. Taking Buddy home wasn't easy. The dog cowered in the back seat during the car ride, his body stiff with fear. When they arrived, Buddy hesitated to step out of the car. James knelt beside him, speaking softly and coaxing him with treats. Slowly, Buddy followed James into the house, his tail tucked between his legs. At home, Buddy stayed close to the door, his eyes scanning the room nervously. James gave him space, letting him explore at his own pace. He set up a comfortable bed for Buddy in the living room and sat nearby, pretending to read while keeping an eye on the dog. Days turned into weeks, and progress was slow but steady. Buddy started to relax, his tail wagging faintly when James entered the room. He followed James from room to room, always staying a few steps behind, as if unsure whether he was welcome. James was patient, offering gentle encouragement and plenty of treats. One evening, while James was watching TV, Buddy surprised him by climbing onto the couch and resting his head on James's lap. James froze for a moment, then gently stroked Buddy's fur. It was the first time Buddy had sought comfort, and James felt a swell of hope. Discovering the past. As Buddy grew more comfortable, James decided to learn more about his past. He reached out to the shelter for details and was shocked to discover that Buddy's previous owner had been his late neighbor, a man James had reported for animal abuse years ago. The revelation hit James hard. He had suspected his neighbor of mistreating animals, but hadn't known the full extent of the abuse. Knowing that Buddy had survived such a cruel past made James even more determined to give him the loving home he deserved. The healing journey. Over the next few months, Buddy's transformation was remarkable. His playful side began to emerge as he chased after balls in the backyard and wagged his tail more freely. James enrolled Buddy in a training class to help him build confidence. Together, they worked on commands like sit and stay, and Buddy began to trust strangers who offered him treats and kind words. But the scars of his past hadn't completely faded. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, and Buddy cowered under the table, shaking uncontrollably. James sat beside him, speaking softly and stroking his fur until the storm passed. "It's okay, Buddy," James whispered. "You're safe now. No one will ever hurt you again." A heroic act. One night, James fell asleep on the couch after a long day. Unbeknownst to him, a fire had started in the kitchen due to a faulty appliance. Smoke filled the house, and the fire alarm blared, but James didn't wake up. Buddy, however, sprang into action. Barking loudly, he ran to James and tugged at his shirt with his teeth. When James didn't respond, Buddy jumped onto the couch, pawing at him and barking frantically. James woke up, disoriented and coughing from the smoke. Realizing the danger, he grabbed Buddy and ran outside, calling 911. The fire department arrived in time to save the house from complete destruction, but it was clear that Buddy had saved James's life. "You're a hero, Buddy," James said, hugging the dog tightly. Tears filled his eyes as he realized just how much Buddy had given him. Not just companionship, but also his life. A heartwarming ending. The story of Buddy's heroic act spread quickly, and soon James and Buddy were local celebrities. They appeared on the news, where James shared Buddy's journey from a neglected shelter dog to a beloved hero. Buddy's transformation was complete. The once frightened pit bull now walked with confidence, his tail wagging proudly as neighbors stopped to greet him on their daily walks. James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the day he had walked into the shelter and met Buddy. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, James looked into Buddy's eyes and said, "You saved me as much as I saved you." Buddy responded by resting his head on James's lap, his eyes filled with trust and love. In that moment, James realized that the void Max had left in his heart hadn't just been filled, it had been healed. Buddy wasn't just a pet, he was family. And together, they had found what they both needed most, a second chance at life.